They told him to learn humility. They didn't say he'd learn how quickly a heart could change. The show's logo flashed across the screen. Life swap. 2 lives. 2 weeks. 1 camera, following every stumble. Every triumph. In the promo cut, a glossy mansion dissolved into a patchwork of terraced fields and clay walls. Voiceover promised growth. Tears. Ratings, for Xiaoya. The promise felt as distant as the city phone number she used to call the help center. Dawn in the mountain village arrived, like a slow exhale. The air was cold and wet, smelling of moss and wood smoke. Xiaoya woke to the creak of their only bed, and the soft sound of her grandfather breathing too loudly beside her, an old rhythm she had learned to measure her life by. She moved quietly, because everything in that house had a reason to be preserved. A cracked bowl, a faded blanket, the single plastic basin they used for washing. She tied her hair back with the frayed string she kept for that purpose, and padded outside, her feet used to the uneven earth. Her morning was a small liturgy water to boil. A thin porridge stirred, a hand pressed to her grandfather's chest to make sure he had air. She checked the basket of mushrooms she planned to take down the hill to the town market. Each one had to be chosen carefully. No bruises, no dirt, the cap intact. Buyers in the market could be cruel and exact. She worked with a practiced economy. Every coin mattered. They called her Xiaoya, Little Rock, because a neighbor once said she was steady as a pebble in a river. It was flattering and wrong. Xiaoya felt more like a reed, flexible, bowed under the current, but snapping if pushed too far. Still, she had a way of looking at the world that made people tell her things. Confessions, gossip, small complaints that meant nothing to others. That way of looking kept her safe and sometimes, unexpectedly, lit a small warmth at the edges of her life. When the production van first rumbled into the village, it felt like a foreign animal. Cameras perched on shoulder rigs, a director with a headset giving clipped instructions, a pair of stylists, laughing at something only they understood. The villagers watched from doorways, hands on hips, children peeking from behind grown legs. For them the cameras were a novelty, a crack in the ceiling, letting in a new kind of light. The swap rules were simple on paper and complicated in practice. 2 teenagers of similar age, from different worlds, would live in each other's shoes. The city sent a polished brochure programming that promised redemption arcs, personal growth, a measured dose of scandal to keep viewers hooked. The village committee signed on, seeing an opportunity to put their stories on television and maybe, perhaps, to draw outsiders who might buy mushrooms or lend a hand. Xiaoya's name reached the producers the old-fashioned way, through a neighbor who owed a favor. She went because it would mean food and because she had a stubborn kernel of curiosity about a world where buildings did not tilt, and the air did not smell of damp wool. Xiaoya arrived in a different kind of sound. The soft pad of leather shoes on marble, the whisper of a jacket moving through an air-conditioned hallway. His life had been arranged from the first breath lessons, bodyguards, a future on the crest of a business empire. He could navigate investor meetings and abstract numbers. But the thing his mother insisted he lacked was a pulse that touched reality. So the show pitched him as an ideal subject. A public-facing heir, who needed to be humanized. He was 21, careful with his words, and the angle of his smile. There was a practiced softness to him around cameras. He knew how to look vulnerable without being ruined by it. His world smelled of cologne and citrus-scented soap, and even his mistakes were polished by people who cleaned up after them. Their first meeting happened because the producers decided it should. A staged, organic encounter where 2 lives would begin to intersect. Xiaoya was on the path, basket balanced, when the van rounded the bend and stopped with a hiss. A man with a clipboard announced, in Mandarin softened by a translator, that this was Shenyu's. For a moment, the village held its breath. Children pushed forward. Elders shuffled to where the shade thinned. Shang stepped down, and the cameras clicked. He looked at the stone path, at the line of houses built into the slope, at the faces turned toward him. He looked like he had stepped into a painting of poverty he'd seen in charity pamphlets, beautiful, tragic, ready-made. He saw her before she noticed him. The way she folded her fingers around the mushroom stalks, with a protectiveness that suggested a fierceness beneath the quiet. Their eyes met hers, measured. His curious. He walked toward her, and the director hissed for them to smile, to act like strangers who might become friends. It began to rain in the way mountain storms do. Sudden, as if the clouds thought better of waiting, the tiny droplets were merciless, working through fabric until everything became heavy. Shang glanced down at the thin shirt Xiaoya wore, then up again at the cameras. Calculating a gesture that would read well on screen, he shrugged out his jacket without thinking of his mother's scolding and stepped close enough that the rain touched them both. She recoiled at first. Reflexive, edge of suspicion. People with jackets did not give them away. But the jacket was warm, and the gesture was simple. A man offering his sleeve to someone wet and cold. He draped the jacket around her shoulders. She accepted it because it was either that, or shiver. "You don't have to pretend for the cameras," he said, words muffled by the rainfall. For a second his voice was ordinary. No practiced cadence. That tiny domestic act, the offering of warmth, sent a small electric shock through the air between them. The cameras rolled. The director muttered approval. In the crowd, a woman with a baby laughed, and said later, half to herself, that he looked like a prince who had tripped and landed in real life. Xiaoya kept the jacket for the walk down to the road. She smelled the fabric, something sharp and citrusian. Thought of how out of place such a smell was in a place used to smoke and earth. For him, the jacket was an instinct rather than a statement. He had been taught to fix things with objects. He still had a childhood habit of believing a solution could be bought or offered, and thus be complete. That afternoon, the cameras shadowed them as they moved through the village. The producers insisted on scenes that showed contrast. Him tasting a boiled yam, and making a face that the crew quickly decided to edit into a moment of faux charm. Her teaching him how to climb a ladder without crushing the cucumbers in its cradles. There were small humiliations for him, and small triumphs for her. He learned to carry a heavy basket, even if awkwardly, and she learned to laugh in a way the director liked, and that made it all less documentary than a constructed fable. They shared a moment at the communal pump. When Xiaoya's hands were ink-stained from cutting labels for the mushrooms she sold in town, Shang attempted to help, and ended up spraying water over his shoes. It was awkward and ridiculous, and, for the cameras, perfect. When he slipped, and she studied him without thinking, the grip of her palm against his wrist lingered longer than either of them seemed comfortable with. He looked at her with a new kind of attention. The sort of attention that weighed, or catalogued, rather than merely glanced. She felt, for the first time in a long while, like someone was seeing not just a problem to be fixed or a subject to be filmed, but a person. Montage. Mornings bending into evenings. Days where he learned to fold the laundry in the way her grandfather had taught her once. The way seams hide mistakes. Nights where she told him, in fragments, about the year her mother left, about the way the town had refused to hire a good father, about the dreams shelved like boxers under a bed. He taught her, clumsily, the names of cities past the mountain, spoke of narrow-suited meetings, and a city skyline that never borrowed the stars. They had small victories. Shang bought new shoes for a boy whose shoes had holes in them and refused, loudly and awkwardly, the applause from the production team. Xiaoya taught him how to patch a tear without a seam ripper, how to coax a stubborn fire to life with old newspaper and patient breaths. He listened. He held the rice, scooped the right way. He learned to apologize, without a camera-ready cadence. Across the village, eyes followed. Li Jingjing, granddaughter of the village chief, watched with a hardness in her jaw that didn't soften when cameras swung her way. Jingjing had made a life out of being the pretty one. The one the teachers praised. The local family's pride. The swap had promised her a chance to be the center. The arrival of Li Xiaoya, with a jacket that drew a city boy's attention, felt like a slight lodged under her skin. She smiled in the cutaways, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. She had plans, alliances through gossip and family ties, and a fear of being eclipsed. The village chief watched more carefully. To him, the show was an opportunity, and opportunities required maintenance. He welcomed cameras and producers like a merchant welcomes customers. With a practiced smile and a mind for profit, he nurtured small rumors that might make better footage, teasing out complaints, planting a phrase here and there, nudging conversations toward conflict, because conflict made for better television and more visitors later. He was polite to Xiaoya in public, but inside conversations he mentioned, with a shrug, how much weight the program could put on a family that played its cards, right? Li Xiaoya's grandfather, thin and tremulous, was another story. He loved her in the only ways he knew, scrappy and practical, but he also had a past collection of debts that sometimes pressed on him like a weight. The producers mistook his mood for wisdom, he mistook their attention for salvation. He accepted small gifts, a few bills from the crew, and told himself excuses he might repeat to a friend. That the money was harmless, that it would fix the roof, that it would help them last through the next lean season. He hid the receipts behind the moth-a-tin blanket. The camera had not yet captured his nervousness. The show's editors would later decide which shots suggested villainy, and which suggested tragedy. For all their differences, the days threaded them together. There was a scene where Sheng tried to help guard a display of mushrooms from a middle neighbor determined to haggle more fiercely than was fair. He stood her ground inelegantly, his hands awkward and flustered, and the neighbor, impressed by his refusal to be intimidated, backed down. Xiaoya felt a strange gratitude. Someone had protected what she had spent hours coaxing into being. That protection shifted something in her. It was not romantic, in the sudden way a movie might claim. It was a recognition of care. The closing of a small gap. They were both learning to be safe in each other's presence. The crew drew breathless close-ups and gentle music to sculpt these moments. Her laugh when he slapped Supriel, and unpolished. His tentative questions about whether she planned to leave the village seemed quiet and intrusive and oddly tender. The producers loved the chemistry, a word they used like a currency. Back in the city, focus groups would call certain scenes relatable, and the show's social feeds would light up with comments stitched into emoticons of hearts and shocked faces. After one evening of ordinary works, sewing a patch until her fingers were raw, sweeping the dirt floor until it shone in a way only a village could make a floor shine, Sheng took out a small object from his pocket, a phone with more storage than sense. He had filmed a silly video earlier, a time-lapse of clouds passing over a rooftop garden. He showed it to Sheng. For him, it was a casual share. For her, it was the world beyond the mountain, compressed to a rectangle of light. She asked a question about how the footage was saved, and he answered, as if teaching something small but important. There was pride in his voice at being able to show her something he loved. There was something in her face that, for a sliver, made his chest feel different. They cooked together one night, under a canopy of tarps, repaired with duct tape. The fire sputtered, and the pan smelled of garlic. He tried to chop and missed a beat, and she took his hand and showed him how to guide the blade. They shared bread, too dry to be called bread by city standards but soft enough for a soul. No one filmed their private awkwardness except the cameras hovering for authenticity. In the quiet, away from the polished light of the crew, a small intimacy developed that lived on actions rather than words. He stayed to find the kettle when it had boiled dry. She waited with a bucket of cold water when his boots sank into a mud patch. It was the kind of closeness that grows from the labor of two bodies, learning to inhabit the same space. At the end of that montage, when evening settled into a blue like ink, left out too long, Xiaoya wrapped Sheng's jacket over a child who had sobbed after missing her mother at the market. He watched as Xiaoya's generosity made something small and human better, and he felt the first honest ache of wanting to be part of making someone safe, not for a camera, not because it might look good in an edit, but because he simply wanted to be that person. If this story is pulling you in, like and follow for the full episode. The early praise and the subtle shifts in their relationship did not make the village safe from its own pressures. Beneath the sweetness of shared meals and small lessons, there were practicalities, money, status, and a network of relationships shaped by survival. The village chief met regularly with the producers, and in those meetings, the idea of boosting ratings by orchestrating friction was never far from the table. He wanted the village to be seen as authentic, yes, but also as compelling. That tension seeded choices that would later bloom into consequences. Li Jingging watched every smile between Xiaoya and Sheng, like someone observing the spread of a rumor. She rehearsed her responses and kept them compact. A fluttered eyebrow, a polite clap that never reached her mother, sitting with the producer over bread and green tea, mentioned private details about the chief family's past, how aligning with the show could secure apprenticeships, small contracts for families with thumbs skillful enough to do embroidery and tile. Jingging's stake in the spotlight made her paranoid, and paranoia tends to find enemies where there are none. Grandfather Li's small secrecy became a larger worry. He had a way of answering the phone in the night and coming back with coins in his palm and the light of worry in his eyes. He told Xiaoya, in a voice low and quick, that he had accepted money to host an extra guest that night from the crew. But he said it like an apology, rather than a confession. Xiaoya could see the tremor in the coins, like a tremor in a future she did not want. He promised to repay when the harvest came. She believed him because she had no choice but to trust the man who taught her to count the steps, and who had once cried because a dog had eaten the only sweater he owned. She did not know, yet, how easily promises dissolve. When people count the days left in a balance sheet, when the rains came heavier than forecast, talk of landslides circulated in the background like distant thunder. The producers debated whether a storm would make for cinematic footage. The village chief told them it would be fine. There was a part of the village that would always brave a downpour because they had to. Because crops and market days could not be postponed, they tied tarps and checked ropes with the pragmatic care of those accustomed to negotiating with weather. On the second week of the swap time stacked into episodes now, each day bait for viewership, Sheng took it upon himself to prove he could be useful beyond symbolic gestures. He volunteered to help move a stack of firewood down a narrow pathway that hugged the mountainside. The path was slick. The rain had begun to pound the earth, turning the soil into a treacherous sheet of mud. Xiaoya wanted to stop him. She warned him in clipped sentences he did not always understand. He smiled, defective, because it looked better on camera when he looked like a brave fool. They were halfway down when the ground, weakened and swollen, gave a sound like the tearing of paper. A small section of earth sheared away above them, an ancient memory of erosion. The hillside deciding, for a breath, to let go. Rocks tumbled. A ribbon of mud surged down, carrying with it the scent of wet clay and loose roots. Sheng slipped. For a moment, everything narrowed to a single motion. A shoe losing purchase, a hand reaching, a shout that might have been any voice. Xiaoya moved like muscle memory had been trained by years of hauling baskets and pulling the family through crisis. She grabbed Sheng's arm and felt it slide like something lubricated by rain. Her palms were raw against his sleeve. He flailed, the camera bobbing as crew members shouted in panic and producers called for safety protocols that would mean little in a split second. The world was all motion. Water, earth, a flash of white as a cameraman was shoved aside to avoid falling debris. He hit something stone. A twisted branch, and the impact had a dignity to it, as if the body had found a place to rest after an unreasonable fall. He did not get up. Xiaoya's heart hammered with a sound too loud to be private. She crouched beside him. The jacket she had kept now wrapped around his shoulders, already soaked and smelling of smoke and grass. Blood shone at the corner of his mouth. She did not know then how serious it was. She only knew the color and the heat it suggested. His breath came ragged, each one a labor. He tried to move, then stopped, eyes wide and clear, and looked at her. For a second, there was an exchange more naked than any earlier smile. His vulnerability was not a contrived moment for the camera, it was bone and breath. He reached up with trembling fingers, and closed his hand around hers, a grip both asking and giving. The crew scrambled. Someone shouted for an ambulance. Someone else for the director. The village, which had been leaning into the storm, now leaned into urgency. People moved, with the slow precision of those used to hauling heavy things, the rhythm of shared rescue. Yet beneath the shared movement lay a different current. Producers whispering about liability, the chief checking the shape of his tie, the camera operator reluctantly letting his equipment fall when a larger rock threatened. Xiaoya pressed the cloth to a cut at Sheng's temple. It was a small, decisive act, and it steadied her in a way she did not expect. She had patched many things holes in baskets, shirts with seams undone, but she had never patched a person who had been taught to carry power the way boys like Sheng had. His jaw clenched around pain and something else. The awareness that he could have been dead. His hand squeezed hers in return, not out of performance but because he needed to anchor on something. And then the siren cut through the rain. The thin line between private crises and public spectacle. Someone in an ambulance waved through the fog of water and the camera kept rolling, because when a moment becomes a story, the world remembers both the emergency and the image that framed it. For Xiaoya, the camera blurred into the background. For Sheng, the camera might have been a ghost at the edge of consciousness, impossible to forget, and irrelevant to the immediate scream of pain. They lifted him onto a stretcher under covers that smelled of disinfectant and plastic. Xiaoya rode in the back of the ambulance, soaked and shivering, the jacket gone to the paramedic who had called for supplies. She watched the city lights approach through rain-streaked glass, like a foreign constellation. Her hands were sticky with blood and mud, and she held them as if they were fragile things to be protected from the world. The producers arranged interviews with practiced calm, even as the hand of the hospital receptionist closed over the paperwork. Footage of the fall would later be edited into a sequence that made hearts hitch and viewers click. For now, the urgency was honest. Doctors worked with efficient, anonymous gesture scoots cleaned. Scans scheduled. Words too clinical to carry grief and relief in equal measure. When a doctor pulled Xiaoya aside, the words were blunt and careful. He asked for details, for where the impact had been, for what she had seen. Her answers were small sentences, accurate because she had to be. He told her to sit and breathe and wait for tests. Someone offered her a blanket and another a chair. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and coffee. For the first time since leaving home, Xiaoya felt the weight of a body that could not be fixed by a seam or a story. Sheng lay in the emergency room under a white sheet. His hand, when he found hers again, felt warm and human. He looked at her with something that had been building in the space between them. Gratitude threaded tightly with an unfamiliar vulnerability. She had saved him. And he knew that debt, in the way someone knows a debt of air. He could have offered money later. Protections. A call to a manager who fixed everything. But none of that mattered in the fluorescent light. There was only this, her hand in his. The soft rhythm of her voice as she tried to make sense of what had happened. Outside, the village sank into storm darkness. The chief counted the cost privately. Jingjing paced in anxious silence because her plan had been so carefully built. And now it teetered. Grandfather Li sat in a chair and counted the coins he still had and realized, with a coldness he could not quite name, that a mistake had been made. Inside the hospital, Sheng's breath evened, pulled quieter by medication and shock. The machines beeped with an impartial honesty. Numbers that translated into a kind of stability. Xiaoya stayed, because there was nowhere else she felt necessary. The producers filmed a few shots of her waiting, legs folded, jacket around her knees, but they also pulled away when asked to respect the moment. Not every moment was content. Some things a camera could not and should not, hold. She did not know yet, then, how the fall would bend their lives. She only knew she had done the small, rough work required when someone teeters on the edge. That night, at the hospital, the rain hit the windows and made lines like the stitches she might someday learn to sew. Outside, the world settled into a hush that felt like a held breath. They had come to swap lives for a show. Neither anticipated swapping hearts. The smile Shang gave her when he woke hours later was different. It was quieter, softer. He mouthed a thank you that was not designed for show, but for the one who had anchored him in a violent moment. Xiaoya answered with a smile that was not yet a promise, but held the trace of one. They were only at the beginning. The mountain had shifted once, and it had left both of them changed in the margin where they touched. The cameras had captured the full, but they had not captured the way a hand could steady a trembling soul. The real work, the consequences, the reckonings, the choices that would test loyalty and demand courage had only just started to unfold. The smile he gave her that morning in the hospital settled into the days that followed like a new weather pattern. Softer, steady, sometimes bright, sometimes gray. Shang's hand, once practiced in corporate gestures, learned the small languages of waiting texting, to ask if she had eaten, leaving a book on the bench by her window, appearing with a thermos of hospital soup that tasted faintly of the city. He came every other day at first, then every day, his collar less sharp each time and his questions less rehearsed. He listened to nurses and learned the names of medications with an awkward humility that surprised the staff. When he spoke to Xiaoya, he looked as if he were trying to learn the syllables of a new language. Careful, a little clumsy, determined. The fall rewired their relationship. It did not erase the camera's footage of the rescue already fed the show's narrative, but it stripped away some of the performative sheen. Outside, pundits debated whether the authentic tears had been coaxed. Inside the fluorescent hush of recovery, such debates were meaningless. For both of them the central fact was simple and unmalleable. Xiaoya had helped him breathe when he could not. That fact lodged itself in a place both awkward and honest. When he was discharged, his movement cautious as if relearning how to carry a body through the air, Shang insisted on returning with her to the village, for a short period. The producers wanted to keep the drama simmering. The crew saw the trip as ratings gold. Xiaoya hesitated, wary of cameras, and the way the village might fold the incident into gossip. But she agreed. The mountain air was the same, damp and honest on. The village greeted them with the odd mixture of curiosity and calculation only a place used to outside attention could manage. Their bond deepened in small, almost ordinary ways. After the ambulance, Xiaoya found herself noticing things in him she had not before. The way his thumb smoothed the edge of his phone screen when he was nervous, the soft exhale he made when he thought no one was watching. He learned to fetch water without spilling, not because someone instructed him on camera but because Xiaoya's patience was the only teacher he could stand without feeling taught. He followed her to the market and carried a crate without announcement, sinking into the muscle of work until his hands were brown with soil. He started bringing a thermos of tea when she delivered mushrooms. An apology transformed into habit. The village, meanwhile, churned with a different momentum. Jingjing's face remained a camera-ready mask. At first her anger was a measured thing, sharp looks, pointed silences, but the seed of bitterness grew in the dark of rumor. She began to align more openly with the chief's gambits, her mother whispering about leverage and opportunities. The chief was an auctioneer of stories now, weighing every statement for how it could be edited into spectacle. He hosted producers in his home and fed them boiled fish and ambitions, coaxing them toward confrontations that would pull in viewers and, he hoped, future business. He spoke in the show's language, narrative, and arc, while thinking in the arithmetic of influence. On the surface he was hospitable. Under the surface, he kept a ledger. Grandfather Li's behavior became more furtive. The coins he had shown Xiaoya at night were not just small windfalls. One evening, when the sky was the color of bruised fruit, He came back with new shoes, and no explanation. He spent longer at the market than came home whispering into a poem. Sometimes he avoided crowds, ducking into alleys where conversations passed like contraband. There was shame in his gait now, a learned quiet that spoke more loudly than any confession. Xiaoya wondered at it. But the old man's shame was wrapped in excuses he had practiced so thoroughly. They sounded like truth. The producers, hungry for drama, yet nervous about liability, began to shift the show's storyline toward protection and exposure of systemic issues. It read well on the proposal memos. A wealthy heir, touched by a brave village girl. Production, as the benevolent eye. But within the crew, some saw the village as a stage, and nothing more. The director argued for more intimate angles. The legal team cautioned restraint. Cameras, once omnipresent and eager, now trembled on a different axis. Footage could save a life, or harm one, depending on which frames were chosen. Then the plan that had been talked about in half-laughed whispers and secretive nods hardened into a reality so ugly that the village, for a breath, forgot to be It was a market day, the kind that filled the valley with bargaining and laughter. Xiaoya had set out before dawn, her basket steady at her hip. The mushrooms a little better than usual. Shang had gone back to the city to handle an interview with a talk show that wanted the rescue angle. His parents had insisted he return quickly for business obligations. For the first time since the fall, the village felt like a place with a hole in its fabric, something missing, even as the clocks continued to tick. A man approached Xiaoya, at her stall no different in dress from many. But his eyes were too quick, too assessing. He asked about the mushrooms, the price, and then, as if he had slipped a key into a lock, spoke in a low tone about opportunity. He mentioned labor in another province where work was plentiful, and girls were needed for weaving and childcare. The words landed oddly. Xiaoya frowned and shook her head. The man smiled, easy and practiced, and produced a small envelope, heavy enough to be real. He suggested travel, a steady wage, someone to care for an elder back home who could pay him. It smelled like salvation to an old man with debts, like solution to people who had counted wrong. Grandfather Li came out then, hands trembling not from the cold but from an inner calculus. He spoke with the man in whispers. Xiaoya watched the exchange close like a book. When the man left, the envelope remained, warm and urgent. Just to get us through. Grandfather Li said at home that evening, the words brittle with justification. A few coins, I'll take work myself they'll. Let me. The plan did not percolate in secret for long. The chief, never one to miss an opportunity for profit, had been speaking to outside agentsmen, who moved quietly, and kept their faces in the shadows. He posited a version of the future where a girl from the mountain, placed in a larger household elsewhere, meant money, alliances, and a cut for those who had maneuvered. Jinjing, pushed by fear and a desire to stay at the center, spun rumors that painted Xiaoya as a restless girl who might leave anyway. It made the idea of transferring her seem like less of a theft and more of a convenience. The night before the plan was to be executed, Xiaoya sat by the stove and listened to Grandfather Li cough. Into the dark, he kept talking about payments and roofs, and how the harvest might not make ends meet. In his voice there was a finality that chilled her. She thought of schools she would never see, and the city skyline. Shang had once shown in a phone clipped the rectangle of light that had felt like possibility. She was tired in that way that made decision thin, like paper pulled between two hands. The morning the men came, they presented themselves with the smoothness of people who had rehearsed decency. They carried clean cups and bowls, and the steady vocabulary of recruiters. One offered Xiaoya tea, warm and fragrant. She accepted because politeness in the village was a kind of law. The cup touched her lips, and for a brief moment it tasted like jasmine and honey. Then, her vision blurred. The world folded and slid away. The ground rose to meet her like a hand. She tried to stand but her legs betrayed her. The market noise wavered and then became distant, as if she were treading through thick water. Someone called her name, a voice, nearer than the market, then farther, then muffled. Jingjing was there, in the blurred periphery. Her face gone pale and smaller than the camera would later make it. Grandfather Li clapped a hand to his mouth. But the sounds he made were not the ones that warned anyone. When she woke, it was on a metal bench in a clinic with her head bandaged and the taste of metal in her mouth. Hands pressed at either side of her. Doctors murmured about toxins, activated charcoal, emergency drains, and IVs. Shang was not there. The cameras had cut away when things turned violent. Editors later argued that some moments were unwatchable. The crew had been there. Shoes in the mud were proof, but now the story would need to be measured, dissected. A producer wiped at her own face and dialed numbers with frantic fingers. Xiaoya tried to speak, and her voice came thin as paper. The doctor said she had been given a sedative and then something else, an unfamiliar compound, meant to disorient. The tests would show how much and where. "You were lucky," a nurse said. "A market stall vendor found you and called it in." Xiaoya's memory of the vendor was fogged. She could only remember the warm cup, the envelope, the look in a pair of eyes that had promised heaven and delivered a not quite death. Word of the poisoning spread like ink in water. Shang turned his phone off for a moment and then on again, his messages a sprawl of guilt and rage. He flew back immediately, hands fumbling with logistics and offers of payment that felt useless in the face of a human harmed. He arrived at the clinic like someone who had been rehearsing every apology, and found that none would fit the rawness of the situation. He took Xiaoya's hand with a steadiness that steadied her. "This is not right," he said, voice low. "We're going to find them?" His statement did not come out of a place of heroics, made for broadcast. It came from the same place that made him stand in the rain and risk his body on a mountainside. It was a stubborn, simple insistence that people should not be preyed upon. The police were involved now, moving with a cautious authority. They took statements, swabbed cups, tested residues. They interviewed attendants at the market, and checked a chain of calls that might lead to the men who had offered the cup. The producers, aware of legal exposure and a growing social media maw, shifted from being storytellers to being witnesses. Some in the crew pushed footage to the police. The camera that had caught the recruiters speaking to the chief, the wide shot where a van lingered near the river. The footage would be instrumental. If there was a public villain in the village's small universe, it was greed arranged in the shape of those who saw value in a child as commodity. The men who had offered the cup were known to operate in other counties. The police found a network that trafficked labor with false promises and quiet brutality. The net the officers cast tightened when the director, driven by a mix of guilt and a desire to be on the right side of truth, handed over a clip showing the chief conferring with two strangers. The clip was grainy, but the gestures were clear. Hands passing envelopes, a nod to sharp, under interrogation. The chief oscillated between denial and a defensive blame cast toward the pressures of village survival. Grandfather Li's name surfaced, not as a direct command, but as an enabler. He had accepted an advance. The police found money funneled through a middleman into an account carrying the chief's mark. In a folder of evidence, there were receipts and a photograph. Shen's butler, who had been given the job of liaising with local authorities, had found on a discarded Tabola man with Grandfather Li's hand on a stranger's shoulder. When confronted with the evidence, Grandfather Li's facade of frailty crumpled quickly into real remorse. He could not fully explain the arithmetic in his head that had led him to a betrayal he insisted he had. Thought it would be temporary, that the men promised work, and that he would bring his family into arrangements that would end with safety. But the money, as money will, had twisted his gaze. He had wanted one last chance at order, at balancing an impossible ledger. The confession when it came was less cinematic than small and gut-rending. He spoke in bursts, naming names, offering details only someone close to the villagers could have known. The police arrested the recruiters at a transfer point, on the outskirts of the county the next day. The men had underestimated how much the presence of a camera, once wielded in good faith, could reveal. Under cross-examination their stories splintered. The chief, who had once held himself above need, found himself facing charges of conspiracy to traffic and complicity. Jingjing's role, shouldered as a reluctant puppet for a moment, was complicated by the fact that she had not touched the cup but had been present at meetings with the civic men. She was questioned and released pending further inquiry. The legal process was patient in the way institutions must be: slow, methodical, sometimes excruciating. Public reaction was swift and fierce. Social media seethed with righteous anger. Viewers castigated the show for exploiting poverty and then failing to protect a participant. The production company issued a statement that promised cooperation with authorities and a review of safety protocols. Ms. Su, Sheng's mother, who had watched the media storm for weeks, sat in the mansion's quiet and felt something like an unmoored responsibility. The family faced scrutiny not only for the show but for their duty to a girl who had saved their son. Apina wrote them into narratives. Savior and beneficiary, defender and patron. Ms. Su read the op-eds, with a face that softened toward action rather than defense. Li Xiaoya's recovery was slow, the doctors cautious in their pronouncements. She had been weakened, not broken. Toxins can be cleansed. Trust takes longer. At the clinic she held Sheng's hand in a way that did not demand more than attention. Her tears were private and jagged. Not the kind that made for a montage. She wanted justice, certainly, but also a space to be safe. Each day she received visitors-producers with eyes that flickered between contrition and calculation, police taking statements, villagers with varying degrees of sympathy. Each call, each conversation added layers to her decision-making. Did she return to the mountain with the people who had so recently conspired? Could a place that birthed betrayal ever be home again? Shen's parents convened a meeting with Xiaoya. After the arrests, Miss Su came with a legal advisor and a folded pamphlet on adoption. Her face, shaped by years of society's expectations, had changed in this crisis. There was urgency in her voice that was not theatrical. It was the kind of urgency that holds a child's future like a delicate object. "We can give you safety," she said simply. "We can give you education in a household that will protect you. We can if you want to be your family." Xiaoya looked at Miss Su. She thought of the moth-torn blanket back home, and a ledger of debt that had made her grandfather trade hope for coins. She thought of the way the chief had smiled as if he were offering a bargain everyone would profit from, and of Jingjing's cold eyes. She thought of Shang's steady attendance at the clinic, and of the way his hand had felt against her wrist, like a small, holding thing. The idea of adoption terrified and tempted her in equal measure. Adoption was a promise and a surrender, a renaming of the future. It meant leaving the mountain for good. It meant that the men who had nearly taken her would no longer live there in proximity to her bed. It also meant that the village which had been her whole world would shrink into a memory. Shang understood this complexity. He refused to say how he felt about her in a way that would coerce her choice. He offered support, legal and personal, and he made it clear that any decision would be hers. 4 days Xiaoya sat with the choice. The police promised protection if she returned. Neighbors volunteered to watch the house. The chief faced legal scrutiny that seemed to take the edge off his immediate threat. But the constant surveillance, the shouting of cameras, the whispers in the market, these things would not quiet just because arrests were made. The men arrested were part of a larger trade. A person's safety is not simply the absence of one danger. Adoption offered an alternative, a new household under the umbrella of a family with resources and influence that could shield her from future predation. On the night she agreed, the sky was a washed bowl of stars. Grandfather Li sat with his head in his hands, the confession having left him hollowed. He asked for forgiveness in the only voice he kept, ragged and small. Xiaoya forgave him in the way she could. She forgave him for what she must, because harboring only blame would not stitch the life she wanted. Her forgiveness did not erase hurt. It was a pragmatic choice. A bandage rather than a cure. She promised to write, to send help when she could, to visit when it was safe. He promised to get help for his debts, and to accept the consequences of his actions. The adoption papers were handled with care and formalities that made Xiaoya anxious, but Sheng's family assured her this was an offer without strings beyond protection and opportunity. Miss Su spoke of schools, tutors, and a quiet room, with a window where Xiaoya could sew or study as she pleased. Miss Su herself had been steeped in a social world where appearances mattered. Now appearances took the shape of a commitment that could alter a life. On the day the adoption was finalized, a small group of villagers gathered, some offering blessing, others offering fistite smiles that could be read as resentment or a different kind of sorrow. Jingjing watched from the edge, her face complex. Not all eyes in the village agreed, and they never would. Moving Day was a brickage of emotion. Xiaoya packed a single suitcase, old clothes, folded with care, the frayed string she used as a hair tie, a small carved piece of wood her mother had left. Very little but everything of meaning. The house she left stank faintly of smoke and old smoke memories, of cooking fires and winters lived through. She pressed a hand against the door frame like someone pausing to press a palm to a painting before it is taken away. The drive down the mountain was quiet. Sheng sat beside her, his arm resting on the back of the seat like someone who was adjusting to being close in a responsible way. He did not speak much. Words seemed both inadequate and dangerous. Near an exchange like this, Xiaoya watched the trees slide by, each one a vertical memory she had to let fall away. The mansion smelled of polish and lemon. It was larger than the village's square, and more silent. Each room, a cathedral of control. Staff moved with discreet efficiency, and a butler, who had once seemed part of Sheng's world, now opened doors with gentleness that suggested he had been prepared for this transition. Xiaoya's room was smaller than she expected, an intimate space, with a narrow desk beneath a window. Miss Su had placed a simple lamp and a stack of notebooks. Sheng had left a single thing on the pillow. The jacket, washed and folded, that had first bridged them in the rain. Xiaoya touched the fabric and felt the roundness of that long-ago kindness. Life in the mansion was an education in new grammars. There were rules translated into rituals, appointments, classes, tutors. Xiaoya struggled sometimes with the vocabulary of the city. Words that roamed above concrete and market wisdom. She learned quickly. Part of her had been schooled in the economy of need, and the cunning economy of survival. Sheng's presence was quiet and steady. He helped with errands without making it a spectacle. He carried groceries in, and learned how to ask when she needed silence. He did not insist on being a savior. He insisted on being a companion in the slow project of rebuilding safety. They found new rhythms. Sheng would make tea in the late afternoon. Xiaoya learned how to read labels on unfamiliar books. He would offer a hand if she wanted to carry a box. She would accept because it was friendship that was measured in the currency of mutual small favors. Their eyes met sometimes across domestic tasks at the sink, on balcony edges, and there were moments where the line between gratitude and affection thinned to a bright thread. They were careful with each other, treating tenderness like a plant that needed light but not sunburn. The legal fallout continued. The traffickers faced prosecution, and were convicted, in a county court. Their network revealed in testimony that included a recorder's voice and shaky footage that the network had handed in. The chief was tried, and faced penalties. The village's complicity was a mirror that many found hard to look into. Some families sued the production for negligence. The company settled quietly, instituting new safeguards and public apologies. The social conversation moved toward practical safety, measures for reality productions and protections for at-risk participants. In some ways, the tragedy catalyzed small policy changes. In other ways, it revealed that the world is slow to change. unless forced. Jingjing's role, complicated by being both daughter of the chief and a person with her own tangled ambitions, became a study in adolescence, strained by power. She apologized in public once her words, a carefully edited moment, and yet the village remembered the awkwardness of participation and the price of wanting to be at center stage. She enrolled in a school in the next county as part of a reconciliation plan, a move that read like exile and education at once. Grandfather Li received a sentence that matched his involvements. He would do community service and submit to counseling and restitution, his hands learning labor that paid directly into the debt he had created. The village watched him work, and then watched as some neighbors offered small kindnesses, a difficult reconciliation that played out in the slow currency of shared days. Shang's family kept their promise to Xiaoya. Tutors arrived. An after-school teacher taught her reading and arithmetic in a language that slid into her like cold water warming. She learned shorthand for city bureaucracy. She learned to navigate the sterile intake of a library. She also learned how to cook a rice dish that Ms. Su favored and, in return, taught Ms. Su how to tie a basket and the order to layer mushrooms for storage. Their relationship matured in the places where people actually grow. In disagreement, and in the weeds of daily living, they argued over small things, over whether it was right to keep a camera crew in the hospital hallway when privacy mattered, over whether the family's PR manager should answer every social outcry with a statement. They reconciled over larger things, the ethics of wealth, the nuances of charity versus respect. When they disagreed, they debated in ways that taught them both restraint. Sheng learned to step back, to listen beyond the urge to fix. Xiaoya learned to accept help that was offered without strings. Romantic feelings threaded their days in a gentle, accumulating way. Shang would stand a little too close sometimes, not to impose but to see the slope of her face in better light. Xiaoya would catch him staring at her from across a room, and find herself smiling for no reason at all, as if a light had been turned on in some quiet chamber. They shared a moment once on a winter evening, when Xiaoya found a box of old family photographs, and Shang sat beside her. As she traced faces with a finger, he learned stories about her mother. The small facts, the half-memories. He did not try to fill them with explanations he did not own. He simply stayed. There were small gestures of care. When Xiaoya had a nightmare about the market, Shang took her to the balcony and let the city air work its slow salve. When he had a panic attack about a board meeting, she made him plain tea, and told him, in the blunt villaged way she had learned, to breathe and take one thing at a time. They fell for each other not in a cinematic flash but in an accordion of reciprocal acts, protection exchanged for tenderness, dependence swapped for independence, as they bolstered each other's edges. The title that had once promised a neat arc fallen, for each other found truth. In the accrual of these moments, neither of them stumbled into romance, like a deed done. Instead they constructed it from the careful inventory of support, from waking to see the other safe, and choosing daily to remain. They held back from declarations they did not mean, and leaned into the trust that felt less like fireworks, and more like the slow formation of a riverbed. Steady, inevitable, reshaping the landscape. Gently over time, not all wounds healed. Xiaoya had nightmares that revisited the cup and the market's chatter. She had days where her chest ached with the absence of her old life's simplicity. Grandfather Li's presence remained complicated. She visited sometimes and brought food and sat in the awkward space of forgiveness that had not yet been perfected. Jingjing. And she shared the same town, yet different futures. They nodded in passing sometimes, the tension between them, a living thing that would not die simply because legal judgments had been made. The reality show, chastened and regulated, continued with a reputation stained, but improved in safety protocols. Producers instituted mandatory counselors and on-site liaisons. The industry paid attention in a way it had not before. The public, moved by Xiaoya's story, donated to community funds that helped villages acquire safer infrastructure. The small policy shifts were not enough to solve the world, but they were steps. And people taking steps after a crisis mattered. In a quiet final scene that felt more like a beginning than an end, Xiaoya stood in her new room and opened a window onto a skyline that did not borrow the stars. Shang joined her with 2 mugs of tea, his hands steady. He did not place the jacket on her shoulders. He had learned that gestures are meaningful only if not required. Instead he handed her a mug, and their fingers brushed. They held the touch a beat longer than necessary, long enough that the pause read like an answer. "Are you okay?" he asked, the question small and honest. She looked at him, feeling the shape of her new life find contour in his presence, a safety net woven by someone who had been a stranger with polished shoes, and had become a companion who carried more than money. "I am," she said, and the word was true in the way a sunrise is true. Sometimes the day is new, and you have to step into it. They did not rush promises. They made a plan instead. To build slowly, to keep visits to the mountain, to write to Grandfather Li, to continue schooling, to decide later about the future that had less to do with spectacle, and more to do with choice. Love, in the ordinary grammar of their days, became an option rather than an inevitability, a thing to be chosen every morning. When the evening settled into the hush of the city, Shang offered his arm, and Xiaoya took it like someone who had learned the value of a steady hand. They walked along a quiet corridor, away from cameras and away from headlines, toward a life that had been rearranged by trauma and kindness in equal parts. Outside, the light from windows painted warm rectangles on the pavement. They moved through them like a small, sure current. If you want to see where their story goes next, how do worlds learn to live together? For more episodes and behind-the-scenes moments,